where that's coming from is she's using a year-over-year approach. At a certain point into Milei's presidency, the consumer price index was 300% higher than it had been a year prior to that. And that's why she's saying inflation shot up under Milei, right? And also the year-over-year figure increased. So Milei took over, and using that year-over-year change in the consumer price index, that kept going up for a while before it started turning around. So that's where they're coming up with it. Inflation soared under Milei up to 300%. No, that's not accurate. I mean, that's not a false statement to use the year-over-year, but the question is year-over-year the right measure to use if we're comparing Milei and his tenure with the prior guy?
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I'm going to be discussing two issues relevant to the economic situation down there in Argentina, specifically Javier Milei's record on inflation and what he's done with rent control. And so we will address each in turn. As far as, well, let me read to you just from the Wikipedia entry on the 2023 Argentine general election, because the timing of this is relevant, and also just to reacquaint yourselves with the timeline in case it's not something that's at the tip of your mind. So here we go. General elections were held in Argentina on October 22nd, 2023 to elect the president, blah, blah, blah. As no presidential candidate won a majority in the first round, a runoff was held on November 19th, in which Javier Milei defeated Sergio Massa to become president of Argentina. The incumbent president, Alberto Fernandez, and incumbent president and former president, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, despite both being eligible for a second consecutive term, did not seek re-election. Okay, also, I should mention that Massa was the Minister of Economy under Milei's predecessor. Okay, so the prior president, Alberto Fernandez, did not seek re-election, and instead his Minister of Economy, Sergio Massa, did. Advancing to the runoff, Massa of the ruling center-left Union for the Homeland unexpectedly came in first place, winning 36% of the vote. This was unexpected because of the severe inflation that took place during Massa's tenure as Minister of Economy. In the runoff, however, Milei defeated Massa with 55.7% of the vote, the highest percentage of the vote since Argentina's transition to democracy. Okay, so it's not that Milei squeaked by there at a photo finish. He actually, in that final round, won with 55.7% of the vote, which apparently was the highest ever since Argentina transitioned to democracy. Okay, and then here's the critical part. Massa conceded defeat. Milei would later be sworn in as president of Argentina on December 10th, 2023. Okay, so that's partly why I read all that, was just to make sure that's fresh in your minds, that Milei was not even sworn in as president of Argentina until December 10th, 2023. So keep that date in mind. Now, we're going to be talking about what happened with consumer price inflation in Argentina, because there's a story that's been making the rounds recently, and there was a blow up on Twitter, and that's what made me realize I should probably do a podcast episode on this, or a portion of an episode, because we're also going to talk about the rent control element. But before I dive in, well, here's the punchline. The punchline is critics of Milei are saying that inflation was way up under his tenure, and that this is horrible because look at what it's doing to the poverty rate and the poor working class. They just have no chance under this inflationary regime that Milei unleashed upon them. And others were saying, ho, 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 I thought you austerity and economists thought that slashing government spending would get inflation under control. But look at, how can you explain you've got basically hyperinflation going on in Argentina? Okay, so these were real arguments I was having with real people. I can't rule out that they were bots, because the way they were responding to my points led me to question their humanity. But nonetheless, these were real interlocutors who were pushing back, and it just became clear that this is a real simple statistical issue that's going on this element of it. All right. So yes, in general, monetary policy, what does it do to price inflation? These are complex topics occasionally. But on this one matter, no, this really boiled down to a simple difference in how you report the consumer price inflation series. Okay. And it specifically has to do with reporting it as what's the change in the consumer price index month to month versus what's called the year over year rate, right? So for a given month, when they come out with what the new CPI reading is, do you compare it to how much did it change versus the last month? And then, you could annualize it if you want. So if it went up a certain amount just in 1 month, you could then extrapolate and say, okay, if that happened 11 more months in a row, what would that mean for a full year, since we're used to thinking of inflation as a yearly figure? That versus, like, if you say, okay, it's September as I'm recording this, and I see now what the latest numbers were, so that would have been for August. And then do I compare that to the July level, or do I compare it to August of the previous year? Okay, and so in different contexts, there's different scenarios in which one versus the other method might be more appropriate, right? So I'm not saying doing the prior 12-month change and reporting that figure. I'm not saying that's useless, but I'm saying in this context, you can see how misleading Milei's critics were. So before I dive into the actual Argentine inflation data, let me first go through something more innocuous where there's not ideology at stake, because I have to say, I think that's partly what was going on here. The people I was arguing with couldn't possibly not be able to grasp the basic point I was making. And I think it was just subconsciously or perhaps consciously, they were looking a move ahead in the argument and realized, oh no, if I admit to him that this is right, then that means I've been a huge jerk the last 10 hours in this Twitter debate. I'm not saying we debated for a full 10 hours. We took breaks, go to the bathroom and eat, stuff like that. Okay, so let me first just walk you folks through a simple example involving weight. All right, so flashing up on the screen, and there's an article that I will write at the Infineo website if you want to go look at that, where I go through this stuff in written form if you want. Okay, but here you go. So a hypothetical person, we're going to look at this guy's weight, and he's going to be on two different regimes of diet and exercise. Okay, so you can see the first column there just shows the month. The second column says weight first of month, meaning on the first of each month, the first day of each month, the guy does a weigh-in and records that. All right, so that's what those numbers mean. And so in red, I've shown what happens when things fall apart. Maybe he's got something going on in his life. We don't know what happened to the guy, but he just starts putting on weight very rapidly. And then he decides at the end of 2023, I got to get my life back in my control. And he starts eating a lot better. He starts going to the gym, and that's what happens, right? So that's what that green indicates, is when he has a change in, hey, I got to turn this ship around. Okay. And then we want to be able to evaluate the changes in his weight. And there's two plausible ways we could do it. And so that's what I've got there in the third column. I'm looking at the weight as of the first day of each month, and I'm comparing it to that same reading the prior month. And then I'm just, subtracting. So to show how much has the weight increased from the prior month. So that's what that column is. And then the last column is looking at the weight, on the first day of a given month, and it's comparing that number to the weight 12 months earlier. So that same month, but the prior year. And that's what that number is showing us, the change from the prior year. Okay, so let's just go through this. I know it's a bit silly perhaps, but humor me, because I cannot express to you how difficult it was to get Milei's critics to see the huge importance of this distinction when the data happened to be like this. And I'm not pulling these weight data completely out of thin air. They're not random. Like, I chose these numbers because it's going to be very similar in spirit to what happened with Argentina's consumer price index. Okay, so the idea is here, just to get a baseline, I assume the guy weighed in at 150 all through the latter half of 2022. And then going into 2023, still it was okay, 150. And then, as I say, things started changing in June of 2023. Maybe something happened in his personal life. Maybe his girlfriend broke up with him, who knows what. But he started gaining weight. And you can see the change from the prior month. What happened? That on July 1st, 2023, he was 5 pounds heavier than he had been on June 1st, 2023. So another way of putting that is he gained 5 pounds during the month of June 2023. And then you can just keep going down that column to see how much weight did he gain during that particular month. Or technically it's pointing to the prior month, because it's showing that number is showing the change in the first of the month compared to the first of the month of the prior month, right? And then again, we said he gets serious. Maybe he starts going to a gym after the new year. A lot of people have New Year's resolutions. Maybe he does a similar thing. He says, this is crazy. On Christmas of 2023, he can't believe he weighs himself. Oh my gosh, I can't believe how heavy I am. And so he says, I'm going to make a change. Okay. So now the way these numbers happen to work out, still, when he goes to weigh himself on January 1st, 2024, he's at that point 50 pounds heavier than he was on December 1st, 2023. Okay. So in the month of December, he gained a whopping 50 pounds. You can see how those numbers play out there. Okay. And then going into the next month, he has gained 10 pounds. And then the next month, he's only gained 5, and then 4, and 3, 2, and then, July through September, he's only put on 1 pound per month. Okay. So as you can guess, I picked these numbers because that's the pattern that you're going to see with Argentina's inflation. In reality, probably you would have expected if the guy's going to the gym and really change things that he would start shedding weight. But I wanted to make the numbers, the spirit of it, as close to the Argentina example as possible, because otherwise, if I didn't do that, if I showed the guy losing weight, then people would object. Oh, that's not what happened. We don't have deflation. All right. So that's why I did it this way. Still, though, if you want to look at these different periods and you said, when was the guy really in trouble? And then when did the change that he made, did his New Year's resolution seem to do anything? Looking at those monthly figures, you can say, yeah, he was really on a self-destructive spiral. He was putting on weight at an alarming rate and an accelerating rate. You can see the gains were, 5, 10, 15, 20. And then again, he put on a whopping 50 pounds just in the month of December. And he still gained weight in January, but he only gained 10 pounds. And he still gained weight in March, but it was only 5, and so forth. And so he got basically stabilized his weight going into the fall of 2024. Okay, so you can say, yeah, he definitely got that under control. And that's clearly the way you would interpret that, looking at the month-to-month figures. What if instead of that, though, the way you reported his weight, you didn't list the actual weights, that column showing the weigh-in, and you didn't even show the monthly change? What if all you had to work with, all you knew about this guy when you're trying to evaluate different periods in his life and to see when was there really an issue and then when did he kind of have things under control again? What if all you looked at was what's the change over the prior 12 months at each weigh-in? And that's all you knew. You didn't see what he actually saw on the scale on a given weigh-in. All you knew was what's that number minus the 12-month earlier reading. And if that's what you had to work with, that's the last column, you would see that the annual change in his weight keeps rising over time, and yet it goes through the New Year's resolution. And it continues to rise, and it doesn't max out. It doesn't peak and then start falling until June of 2024. And then it starts coming down, right? So looking at that, you might suppose, and also you could say too, that geez, like as of September of 2024, he's 167 pounds heavier than he was a year earlier. So you might still think there's something really going on with this guy, that he's doing off, even as of September. Something's terrible. What are you doing, man? You got to stop eating so much. You've gained 167 pounds over the last year. What the heck have you been doing in September? You see how that would be extremely misleading. And you say, no, actually, September, he was fine. He didn't add anything more. Calories in, calories out kind of deal. The problem clearly was what happened in the fall and winter of 2023. That's where he put on all the weight. And yet, looking at the year-over-year change, which is what that last column is, you would misdiagnose it. You would think that the problem kept getting worse through the summer at least. And only then did it start getting a little bit better, but it would still look like it was really bad, red lights flashing as of September. Okay? All right. So I think you probably see where I'm going with this. Let me, just to motivate so you can understand, I'm not attacking a straw man here. Let me read. This is a tweet from Isabella Weber, who is a progressive economist at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Her Twitter bio says that she's she's won the Joan Robinson Prize, the Keynes Prize, the Rothschild Prize, and another prize. I don't know how to pronounce that name. So not exactly a fan of Milton Friedman. She also recently was on my radar because she's done work on price gouging. And so she had come out in defense of Kamala Harris's anti-price gouging proposal, for example. Okay, so here's Isabella Weber's tweet. Shock therapy, once more doing what shock therapy does. And she's quoting with a screenshot an article that says Argentina's poverty rate soars above 50% under Javier Milei. Latest data blamed on government austerity measures as radical libertarians' popularity wanes. Okay, so now back to Isabella Weber's commentary. Shock therapy, once more doing what shock therapy does. After Milei abolished price controls and slashed government spending, inflation shot up to roughly 300%. 3.4 million Argentinians pushed into poverty. Poverty rate the highest level in 2 decades. At least 136,000 jobs were wiped out. All right, so in this particular episode, I'm not going to push back on her other claims. I have seen pro-Milei people arguing with these numbers and saying that that's either just outright wrong or it's very misleading about the poverty figures, but put that aside. All right, I don't want to talk about that right now. What I want to just focus on is this inflation shot up to 300% under Milei. That is incredibly misleading. Where that's coming from is she's using a year-over-year approach. Okay, so at a certain point into Milei's presidency, the consumer price index was 300% higher than it had been a year prior to that. And that's why she's saying inflation shot up under Milei, right? And also the year-over-year figure increased. So Milei took over, and using that year-over-year change in the consumer price index, that kept going up for a while before it started turning around. So that's where they're coming up with it. Inflation kept, soared under Milei up to 300%. No, that's not accurate. I mean, that's not a false statement to use the year-over-year, but the question is year-over-year the right measure to use if we're comparing Milei and his tenure with the prior guy? So here, this chart I'm showing you, it's not in English, but this is the consumer price index, the monthly amounts. So you can see it was 12.7% in September of 2023, 8.3 October 2023, 12.8 in November of 2023, and then it went up to a whopping 25.5% in December of 2023, right? So that was the last month of the previous administration, and now Milei gets sworn in that month. And by the way, these numbers don't mean an annualized rate. No, it's saying prices in December of 2023 rose 25.5% relative to the prior month. Okay, so if that had kept up, that would be an enormous annual increase, right? These are just like literally how much did prices rise in these particular months. Okay, so Milei is sworn in December. Then in January of 2024, the first full month when he's in office, prices rose 20.6%. They fell to 13.2, then to 11, then to 8.8. By May, they were down to 4.2, and so on. They troughed at 4% in July, and then in August, they were at 4.2%. Okay, so again, not an amazing feat compared to the United States, for example. That would be an outrageous consumer price inflation rate for the U.S. But given what Milei inherited, and then you can see what he did with it, clearly he broke the back of inflation, consumer price inflation, right, and got it under control. And so you can see the connection now between these figures and what I did with my hypothetical weight example to show what's going on here. And if you just reported annual year-over-year figures, that would be extremely misleading. All right, the last thing I'll flash up here on this issue is just to show a nice diagram showing a chart of the monthly inflation rate separated by the prior administration versus Milei. Okay, so I think that makes it crystal clear what's happening. So now you know. Okay, now that we've sort of set the record straight as far as the numbers and how you should interpret it when people are saying, oh, inflation shot way up under Milei, and you understand what's going on there, let me now just pivot a bit to talk about, in general, some of the commentary. So, strictly speaking, I don't think it's correct to say that government spending drives, people will say drives inflation. Usually what we mean is consumer price inflation. Sorry, I'm not going to keep saying that, but that in this context, that's usually what people mean. Okay. And you see this even on fans, like people that would probably agree with my economic and political views. All right. So here I'm actually not criticizing Keynesians. I'm also talking about people, quote, on my team. That a lot of times they think, oh yeah, it's government spending. So again, strictly speaking, I don't think it's correct to say government spending is what drives consumer prices up, and that austerity measures, by which, if what we mean by that is just cutting government spending, that's what's going to bring consumer price inflation down. And the reason I'm saying that is as a theoretical, principled matter. Conceptually, you can imagine the government could spend boatloads of money, could be borrowing tons of money, but if the way it's financing those deficits is just by borrowing already created money that's in private sector hands, so that the Treasury issues bonds, people in the private sector buy the bonds, give the money to the government, and then the government spends that, that's not creating new money, right? It's not that there's more money chasing the same amount of goods, which is what would tend to push up prices. All it does is people in the private sector now have less money to spend in that round because instead of spending their money, they've handed it over to the government to buy bonds, is one way of thinking about it. Okay, so there's not more total dollars in existence if you just narrowly look at the fact that the government is borrowing money to spend it. Okay. On the other hand, even if the government has a balanced budget, still, if the central bank for some reason quadruples the quantity of money, then that could lead to a surge in consumer price inflation, right? So you can see how the two aren't necessarily logically connected. Now, in practice, there is correlation between government spending, especially if it's deficit financed, and price inflation. And that's because in practice, it often is the case, if the government is running a large budget deficit, they want to keep interest rates on government debt down to reduce the servicing costs of that debt that's, growing, that burden. Just like if you're running up credit card bills or credit card debt, if you keep getting offers in the mail to roll it over at a new introductory APR of 1.9% for 6 months or whatever, then the pain of running up that huge credit card debt doesn't bite you as much, right? So the same thing happens with government finance. If the government is running massive deficits, they might lean on the central bank to say, hey, you have to keep interest rates low. And so then the central bank might create more money, buy government bonds like through the secondary market. It's the way it happens in the United States from the primary dealers. And then it's sort of like a backdoor way by which the central bank can monetize the deficits. All right. So because in practice, that's often how it works, that's why you tend to see excessively high government spending in excess of normal tax receipts go hand in hand with surging price inflation. Certainly during wars, you see that a lot. So that's why there is that connection, but I'm just pointing out, to be pedantic, but just to teach economics, that strictly speaking, it is not, in my view, government spending per se that causes a general rise in prices. Just like in general, if some company starts spending a bunch of money because they're building new factories or whatever, I wouldn't expect that to make prices in general go up. It's like, no, that company's expenditures, if the quantity of money is held fixed, probably means that somebody else's expenditures go down. Okay, now the reason I just said probably there, you might have expected me to say necessarily, but no, because even there's another wild card to all this. I guess you could talk about it as the velocity of circulation. That's one way people can think about it, right? So even with a fixed quantity of money, it's possible for the currency to collapse. If everybody was absolutely convinced that there was going to be hyperinflation, that would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If everybody holding dollars thought the dollar is going to lose 99% of its purchasing power this year, meaning prices in general are going to be 100 times higher 12 months from now than they are right now, what would you want to do? You'd want to get rid of dollars at any dollar-denominated asset, right? You'd empty your checking account, any bonds that you held that were just nominal, they weren't like indexed to inflation or something. You would want to sell those off and get into stocks or real estate or some other kind of asset that wasn't defined in terms of US dollars. And so in the act of everyone trying to do that, what would that do? That would push up prices measured in dollars, right? The US dollar would fall against other currencies. All that stuff would happen. Okay, so again, that thought experiment, I'm just trying to show it's not even enough just to say, oh, consumer price inflation is ultimately driven by the quantity of money. That no, the expectations can affect it as well. All right, so another way of putting it is a crude version of what's called the quantity theory of money is false. It's not true that if the authorities increase the quantity of money by 10%, then prices go up 10%. It's not even true if you say, oh, what if you take into account changes in production? Right? So you might think, oh, if the quantity of money goes up 10%, but real GDP goes up 3%, then prices only go up 7%, or, whatever the exact thing is to get the multiplication right. And No, that's not necessarily true. It doesn't have to be. Because again, people's demand to hold money is also a factor. That's a different way of putting it. It's not just the supply of money, but the demand to hold money that influences the quote price of money, which is like the purchasing power of money or the price level. Okay? Just like you can't predict what happens to the price of apples just by knowing how much did apple production change this month versus last month or even versus last year. It's possible that the demand for apples also moved. Okay, so same thing with money. Okay, next topic, rent control. So here, let me just read some snippets. Reason had a good article on this. This is from October 26th by Katarina Hall. The title is Rents Fall and Listings Increase After Javier Milei Ends Rent Control in Argentina. So the President Milei sweeping economic reforms that touch many sectors. There was a 2020 rental law that was enacted under the former president, Alberto Fernandez, which, among other provisions, it mandated 3-year lease terms, meaning if you wanted to rent an apartment, the landlord couldn't keep it contained, couldn't just say, okay, well, we'll do it month to month, or we'll do a 6-month lease, or even do a 12-month lease. No, it mandated the lease has to be for a 3-year period, right? Which is going to make landlords not want to enter into such a lease in an inflationary environment, particularly if you don't have flexibility in what the unit of account is. Okay. And it also, that 2020 rental law, besides mandating a 3-year lease, required the rent to be paid in Argentine pesos. Right. So one way the landlords could have gotten around it to say, okay, you're forcing us to sign 3-year contracts with new tenants, which we, other things equal, we don't like because we want flexibility. But okay, let us at least charge it in terms of euros or dollars, or index it to the world price of gold or something. No, you couldn't do that. No, it's got to be priced in the local currency. And you say, okay, well, we can deal with all that, but at least let us renegotiate what the rent is, quoted in pesos, month to month or something, right? No, the 2020 rental law also mandated that you could only update the rental rate, again, which had to be denominated in pesos, once a year. And they say, okay, fine, but surely you're going to let us adjust it based on market conditions, right? And whatever the market will bear. No. Once the tenant gets in, you can only raise the rent based on, an index that the central bank published that had to do with what happened in general with inflation and wage rates. And that was so it was locking you in. So given all of those constraints, guess what happened? By late 2023, 1 in 7 homes in Argentina sat empty. And also what was interesting is he still had large rental price hikes. It says a study by the Institute of Economic Research of the Cordoba Stock Exchange found that rents increased by an average of 140% in inflation-adjusted terms between 2020 and 2023, right? So even though price inflation was rampant over the course of those 3 years, they're saying rents, even adjusting for that, rose 140%. All right, and again, that's partly because it wasn't just that the currency was rapidly losing its value in general, but because of that onerous 2020 rent control law, a lot of landlords were who own buildings that normally would have been rented to tenants, and that would have added to the supply of housing. Instead, they was like, well, no, I'm not going to rent to new tenants under these onerous terms. It's just locking me in. That's great. And so they could do other things with the buildings, including leaving them vacant, waiting for a better opportunity instead of getting locked into a 3-year lease where, depending on how the currency fared, maybe you would end up getting screwed as the landlord, right? So that's what was happening. So it was withholding a lot of supply from the market, which is why rent increased faster than general price inflation over that 3-year span after the controls were implemented. Okay, so Milei comes in December 2023. As we said, he repealed that law as part of his broader push of deregulation. And let's see. So this is a quote. So this is from a Newsweek article that the Reason writer is quoting from. For many locals, finding a new apartment had become mission impossible, but after the repeal, Buenos Aires saw a doubling of available rental units and rental prices have stabilized. All right, by June 2024, rental listings increased by 184%, with a 62% jump in May alone, according to Argentina's largest property site, Zona Prop. Okay, and then the last thing I'll mention here because I've seen the statistic going around in headlines on Twitter. So it says, while rents are still up in nominal terms, many renters are getting better deals than ever, with a 40% decline in the real price of rental properties when adjusted for inflation since last October, the Wall Street Journal reported. Okay, so that was the little snippet I saw going around Twitter, was showing Javier Milei with a chainsaw, because that's part of his promotional shtick. Like, I'm going to take a chainsaw to all these regulations and red tape or whatever the bureaucrats are using to hold you down, that kind of thing. And it was saying, after repealing rent control law, apartment rental rates down 40% in Argentina, something like that. So again, just be careful if you're lauding that yourself. It's not saying that the absolute number of pesos that you had to pay to rent an apartment went down 40%. That's not what it's saying. The amount you had to pay to rent an apartment was still going up, but the idea is, if you looked at rental rates as of late summer, early fall of 2024, compared to what they had been since last October, I should say, that they're saying that relative to the general price level, rents were down 40%. That's the idea. All right. And that all makes perfect sense, right? That by unlocking the onerous restrictions that allowed for the supply offer to explode. And so you can see why that would allow an expansion of supply where rental prices did not have to rise as much as the general price level, which is why, even though it's sort of like undoing, it's like the mirror image of what happened earlier, right? So from 2020 through 2023, because supply had been crashing, as the peso in general lost value, just because they were pumping in boatloads of new pesos, right? That the price of housing rose more, or rental housing rose more than prices in general. But then once Milei got rid of the rent control and restored flexibility to that sector, that allowed for a massive expansion in the quantity brought to market of rental units. And so that was a countervailing force. So even though the peso, as we saw, did still lose value month to month, even after Milei came in, just the rate of monthly depreciation, the peso's value fell off a cliff. You didn't see rental prices going up as much, right? And so over time, apartment rents became much more affordable, but more back in line with just the general level of prices, partially undoing what had happened from 2020 through 2023. Okay, so that's a good spot to wrap up. We will continue to monitor the progress that Javier Milei makes in Argentina. It's a very interesting case study to show what happens when a country is dominated by progressive left-wing ideology and economic policy, and then somebody comes in who's quite radical, both in his proposals and his bombastic rhetoric. And hopefully the people of Argentina will benefit from what I think is a move towards more sensible policies. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.